It started in my second year of art school. I couldn't paint. For an art student, that's like a musician going deaf. Everything I put on the canvas just looked muddy and dead. It felt like all the color had drained out of the world and out of me. For weeks, I'd just sit in my dorm room, staring at a blank sketchbook, feeling nothing. My grades were slipping, and I was just completely and utterly stuck. Friends told me I just needed to get out more, but I couldn't. I finally made an appointment at the campus health center. I figured they'd tell me to get more sleep or something. The campus clinic was sterile and smelled like disinfectant. I remember the doctor didn't look up from his computer much. He asked me a few questions from a list on his screen. Was I having trouble sleeping? Yes. Was I losing interest in things I used to enjoy? Yes. I tried to explain about the painting, about how it felt like my hands were disconnected from my brain. He just nodded and kept typing. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. He told me it sounded like a classic case of mild depression and anxiety. He spun his monitor around to show me a website for a popular SSRI. I'd seen the commercials. I told him I was worried about the side effects. I'd read online that it could make you feel numb, like a zombie, and I was scared of that. I remember saying something like, "I'm an art student. I kind of need my feelings, even the bad ones." He just gave this little tired laugh. He said, "That's mostly internet chatter. The most you'll probably feel is some mild nausea for a week while your body adjusts. It's better than feeling like this, right?" He made it sound so simple, so trivial, like I was being dramatic. I didn't know what else to say, so I just nodded. He printed the prescription and handed it to me. The paper was still warm. I walked out into the cold air feeling a little bit of hope, but also this deep, weird feeling of dread. I just wanted to be able to paint again. I had no idea that little piece of paper was the first step toward losing my mind entirely. The first few days on the SSRI were just like the doctor said. I was nauseous and had a dull headache, but I kept taking the little white pill every morning. I remember thinking that even the nausea was better than the crushing emptiness I'd been feeling. After about a week, the sickness faded. And then, something else happened. It was like a switch was flipped on in my brain. I was walking to class, and suddenly, the colors of the autumn leaves looked impossibly bright. I could see every shade of red, orange, and yellow. It wasn't just that the depression was gone. It was like a filter had been removed from my eyes, and I was seeing the world for the first time. I didn't go to class. I ran back to my dorm, pulled out a fresh canvas, and started to paint. The paint felt alive in my hands. The ideas flowed out of me so fast, I could barely keep up. I finished an entire painting that night, and it was good. It was more than good. It was vibrant and full of life. I felt alive. That first painting broke the dam. I stopped going to most of my classes. I barely ate. Sleep felt like a complete waste of time. I would paint for 18 hours straight, my body humming with an energy I'd never known. My dorm room filled up with finished canvases. When I ran out of canvases, I drew in my sketchbooks, filling them up in a single night. When I ran out of paper, I started scribbling ideas and designs on the walls. My thoughts were racing, stacking up on top of each other. It was a storm of pure creativity. I knew this wasn't just the medication working. This was something more. I wasn't just getting my talent back, I was tapping into something elemental. I remember looking at a series of paintings I had just finished and thinking to myself, this is what it feels like to be a genius. It wasn't ego. It was a simple fact. I was seeing connections and patterns in art and history that no one had ever seen before. I was creating a new language on the canvas. I was convinced I was about to become the most important artist of my generation. I wasn't an art student anymore. I was a visionary. Everything that had happened before, all the depression and the creative block, was just part of the story. It was the necessary suffering you had to go through before the revelation. I had paid my dues, and now I was receiving my gift. I felt powerful, invincible. I was on the cusp of changing art history forever, and I couldn't wait for the rest of the world to catch up. The dorm room was too small. The paintings were good, they were more than good, but they were flat, two-dimensional. My vision was bigger than that. I had filled every canvas, then I covered the walls with drawings, but the ideas kept coming, stacking up on top of each other until I felt like my skull was going to crack open. I needed to build something real, something you could walk around. The thought hit me like a lightning strike. The university art building, the sculpture department was on the ground floor. It had everything: kilns, giant rolls of paper, bags of plaster and clay, wood, metal, welding equipment. All of it was just sitting there in the dark, waiting. It was a treasure chest, and I had the key. Or I could make one. I didn't even put on a coat. I walked out of my dorm and into the cold night air. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. The campus was completely silent and empty. I felt like the only person awake in the entire world. I remember walking across the main quad, my heart pounding, but not from fear. It was excitement. I felt like I was on the most important mission of my life. I got to the art building and circled around to a side door that I knew had a faulty lock. It took me less than a minute. The door clicked open, and I slipped inside. The air inside was thick with the smell of turpentine, sawdust, and wet clay. It was the best smell in the world. I didn't turn on the main lights, just a single work lamp in the corner of the main studio. It cast long, dancing shadows. It felt like a sacred space. My space. I saw the stacks of materials, and I almost laughed. It was all mine. I didn't have a plan. The plan was coming from somewhere else, being beamed directly into my head. I started grabbing things. I ripped open a 50-pound bag of dry clay and just poured it onto the floor. I found the spigot and drenched it with water, then started stomping on it, mixing it with my boots. I grabbed armfuls of scrap wood from a bin, snapping the smaller pieces over my knee. I found buckets of house paint left over from some other project and just started pouring them onto the clay pile. Red, yellow, and blue, all swirling together into a spreading, muddy lake. It was frantic. I was working faster than I had ever worked in my life. I found a roll of canvas, 10 feet wide, and unrolled the whole thing across the floor, right over the paint and the clay. I started throwing wet plaster on it with my bare hands. I remember thinking to myself, I'm not making a sculpture, I'm giving birth to one. It wasn't about control, it was about release. I was just a channel for this incredible, violent energy. I have no idea how long I was in there. The sun started to come up, sending pale light through the high studio windows. I was covered in paint, plaster, and sweat. The huge room was a complete disaster. There were broken tools, empty containers, and a giant, heaving mound of garbage in the middle of the floor that was my masterpiece. In my mind, it represented the birth of a new kind of art, the death of painting and the beginning of something else. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I hadn't just used up a few supplies. I had used everything. Thousands of dollars worth of material, gone in a single night. I stood there, breathing heavily, completely and utterly satisfied. I had done it. I had changed the world. I don't know how long I stood there, just looking at it. But then I heard the sound of keys, and the heavy metal door scraped open. A campus security guard stood in the doorway. He was an older guy, with a paunch and a tired face. He just stared. His mouth was open. He took in the whole scene. The giant mess on the floor, the paint on the walls, and me, standing in the middle of it all, covered head to toe in plaster and dirt. I smiled at him. I was so excited to finally be able to explain it to someone. I started talking, the words spilling out of me. I told him how I had solved art, how this wasn't just a sculpture, it was a new beginning. I pointed to the swirling mound of junk and tried to explain what it represented. He wasn't getting it. His face went from confused to angry. He pulled out his radio and started speaking into it, his voice low and urgent. That's when I realized he thought I'd done something wrong. I remember thinking, he doesn't understand. He just sees a mess. More people started to show up. Another security guard, then a man in a suit who I think was a dean. They weren't looking at the art. They were all looking at me. Their faces were a mixture of pity and fear. I stopped talking. I could feel the energy draining out of me, replaced by a cold, buzzing confusion. The next part is a blur. I don't remember being handcuffed, but I remember being put in the back of a car. It wasn't a police car. They drove me to the county hospital and took me to the psychiatric unit. The world that had seemed so bright and full of meaning just hours before was suddenly muted and gray again. A doctor with tired eyes, just like the one at the campus clinic, asked me questions. I couldn't really answer them. They kept me for 2 weeks. They told me I had bipolar I disorder. They said the SSRI I was taking had pushed my brain into a severe manic episode with psychosis. It was a common reaction, he said, for people with underlying bipolar. I never went back to the art building. I was expelled from the university. A few weeks later, I got a bill in the mail for $13,000 to cover the cost of the materials I had destroyed. I was 20 years old, diagnosed with a lifelong mental illness and thousands of dollars in debt. I went to a doctor looking for a cure for my mild depression, something to help me paint again. Instead, I got a cure that destroyed my life. I haven't picked up a paintbrush since. My story started on a Tuesday in July. I was a framing carpenter, and we were behind schedule on a whole subdivision of new houses. The foreman was pushing everyone hard. It was hot, I was tired, and I got lazy. Instead of waiting for my partner, I tried to lift a laminated beam by myself. I felt a pop in my lower back, and then a searing pain shot down my leg, and I just dropped. The pain was something else. It felt like a hot knife was stuck in my spine, and every time I tried to move, someone was twisting it. I couldn't work. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even sit in a chair without gritting my teeth. For a week, I just laid on the couch, gobbling ibuprofen and trying to tough it out. But the pain wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and made an appointment at a walk-in clinic. I remember the doctor was young and seemed rushed. I explained what happened, and I told him flat out that I didn't want any heavy-duty painkillers. I'd seen what OxyContin did to a couple of guys I knew, and I wasn't going down that road. I just needed something to take the edge off so I could get back to work. He nodded like he'd heard it 100 times. He said, "I understand completely. We're not going to use any of those traditional narcotics. There's a much better option." He started writing on his prescription pad. "This is called tramadol. It's a synthetic. It works on the brain in a similar way, but it's a safe, non-addictive alternative to opioids. Safe. Non-addictive. Those were the magic words. It felt like I had won the lottery. Here was a doctor who actually listened. He was giving me exactly what I wanted. A way out of the pain without the risk. I walked out of that clinic holding the prescription slip like it was a golden ticket. I thought I had found the perfect solution. Turns out I'd just been handed a different kind of trap. I got the prescription filled that same day and took the first pill in my truck right in the pharmacy parking lot. About an hour later, something amazing happened. The searing pain in my back didn't just get duller, it was gone. Completely. But there was something else. It wasn't like a drowsy opioid high. It was the opposite. I felt a clean, warm wave of energy wash over me. My mind was sharp, focused. The world looked brighter. The next day on the job site was a revelation. I wasn't just working without pain, I was working better than ever before. I was lifting more, I was faster. I was thinking 3 steps ahead. The foreman even clapped me on the shoulder and said it was good to have me back. At the end of the day, I wasn't even tired. I went home and cleaned out the whole garage. I felt incredible. I felt invincible. This wasn't just a painkiller. This was a miracle drug. After about a week, the miracle started to fade. 1 pill in the morning didn't last the whole day anymore. The pain would start to creep back in by noon, and that beautiful, stimulating energy would disappear. So I started taking another one at lunch. Soon, my 30-day supply was lasting about 20 days. Then 15. That's when the cycle started. For 2 weeks, I was a machine. I was the best carpenter on the crew, a perfect husband, life of the party. Then the bottle would run dry, and the hell would begin. The back pain would come roaring back, 10 times worse than the original injury. But on top of that was a sickness I'd never known. I'd get cold sweats, my legs wouldn't stop twitching, and a horrible anxiety would crawl all over my skin. I couldn't sleep. I could barely eat. All I could do was lie on the couch and stare at the calendar, counting down the days until I could get my refill. Going back to the doctor became a performance. I'd make sure not to shave for a couple of days. I'd walk into the clinic with a limp, wincing when I sat down. I'd tell him the pain was unbearable, that I couldn't function. I never had to try very hard. He'd just nod, ask if the tramadol was still helping, and tap away at his computer. He never questioned it. He'd just print out a new script. I'd walk out of there feeling this huge wave of relief, clutching that little piece of paper. The pain in my back wasn't the issue anymore. The real problem was the week and a half of my life I had to lose every month, just waiting for the cure. The routine continued for a few more months. I was a superhero for 2 weeks and a miserable wreck for 1. Then we got a new contract. It was a big one, a custom lodge build way up in the timber country, a good 3-hour drive from home. We were scheduled to be on site for almost a month straight, staying in a rented trailer near the job. I counted my pills before we left. I knew it would be close. I told myself I'd make them last. Stupid move. Of course I didn't make them last. The work was hard, the days were long, and I was popping them for energy as much as for pain. With about 3 days left before we were supposed to head home for the weekend, I reached into my bag for the bottle. It was empty. The familiar cold panic washed over me, but this time it was different. I was 200 miles from my doctor. There was no faking a limp and getting a refill. There was no way out. I thought about it for a minute. It was only 3 days. I had been through the withdrawal a dozen times before. It was hell, but I had always survived it on my couch. I figured I could do it here. I just had to get through 3 shifts. It would be like having a bad flu, I told myself. I could sweat it out, tough it out. That first night, I knew I had made a horrible mistake. The minute I lay down in the cheap trailer bed, it started. My legs began to twitch and kick on their own. The deep, grinding ache came back into my spine, but it was 1,000 times worse than the original injury. Then the cold sweat started, soaking my clothes even though I was shivering. My heart was pounding in my ears. I lay there in the dark, my body screaming, listening to the other guys on the crew snoring in their bunks. This wasn't like the flu. This was something else entirely. It felt like every nerve in my body was on fire. I had been through this before, but never like this. Always before I was at home, safe. Here I was trapped. I had made a terrible, terrible miscalculation. I just stared at the ceiling, shaking, knowing I had to somehow get up in a few hours and swing a hammer all day. And I still had 2 more days to go. The next day on the job was a special kind of hell. I made it out of the trailer, but every muscle in my body screamed. It was worse than the shakes. It was a deep, electric vibration that felt like my bones were humming. On top of the opioid sickness, the sweats and the nausea and the aching, something new started. A zapping feeling in my head. It would happen without warning. It felt like a quick, powerful electric shock behind my eyes, and for a split second the whole world would tilt and buzz. My vision would blur, and I'd have to stop and grab onto something to keep from falling over. The first time it happened, I was climbing a ladder, and I almost fell 2 stories. After that, I just tried to stay on the ground, pretending to be organizing materials. I dropped my hammer. I tried to pick it up, and my hand was shaking so badly I couldn't grip the handle. The foreman was looking at me. I could feel his eyes on me. I somehow made it through the day. I have no idea how. I just remember the relief of getting back to the trailer, wanting to just collapse. But the real torture was just beginning. It wasn't quiet in the trailer anymore. I started hearing things. At first it was faint, like a skill saw running in the distance, but I knew nobody was working. Then it got closer. It sounded like people were whispering right outside my window. Angry whispers, but I couldn't make out the words. I buried my head under the thin pillow, but it didn't help. The zaps in my brain were getting more frequent, more violent. Each one felt like a flashbang going off in my skull, followed by the sound of rushing static. The leg twitching turned into full-body jolts. I was lying there in the dark, soaking wet with sweat, listening to phantom power tools and angry ghosts, while my brain was being electrocuted from the inside out. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die. Then came the big one. It wasn't like the other zaps. It was a massive, blinding flash of white light behind my eyes that seemed to erase everything. My entire body went rigid. I remember an animal sound coming out of my own throat, a noise I didn't recognize. My back arched so hard I thought my spine would snap. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, thrashing, my arms and legs slamming against the cheap metal bed frame. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. My head hit the floor, again and again. I vaguely remember the trailer door bursting open and one of the guys from my crew screaming my name. Then everything went black. I've had asthma my whole life, but this was different. It started as a faint wheeze in my chest, the kind I usually ignore. But it didn't go away. Instead, it got tighter. It felt like an invisible band was being slowly tightened around my ribs. I sat up in bed, reaching for my rescue inhaler on the nightstand. I took a deep puff. Nothing. I took another. Still nothing. The panic started to set in. Breathing felt like trying to suck a thick milkshake through a tiny coffee straw. My wife woke up to the sound of me gasping. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at my chest, my eyes wide. She knew the look. We'd been through this before, but never this bad. The trip to the hospital is a blur. I just remember leaning my head against the cold passenger window, focusing every ounce of my energy on pulling in the next tiny sliver of air. The world outside the car didn't exist. There was only the sound of my own ragged wheezing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I was suffocating, and I was terrified. The moment we got to the emergency room, everything happened at once. A nurse saw me stumbling through the door, my face pale, and immediately shouted for a bed. They ripped my shirt open, stuck probes on my chest, and strapped an oxygen mask to my face. The feeling of that cool, high-flow oxygen hitting my lungs was the most profound relief I have ever felt in my life. A doctor rushed in and ordered a breathing treatment. For the next 10 minutes, I just sat there, clutching the mask, breathing in the fog of albuterol as the knot in my chest slowly, finally, began to loosen. After I was stable, the ER doctor came back to talk to me. He looked tired. He told me the attack was severe, life-threatening. He said they needed to hit the inflammation hard and fast to prevent a relapse. He scribbled on a prescription pad and handed me the slip. "This is a high-dose course of oral prednisone," he said. "It'll knock this thing out for good." Then, as he was turning to leave, he added, "Just a heads up, it might make you feel a little energetic, maybe a bit irritable. It's a common side effect." He said it so casually, like he was talking about an upset stomach. I just nodded, grateful to be alive. Energetic and irritable sounded a hell of a lot better than not breathing. I had no idea what I was in for. The first day on the prednisone felt like a miracle. I took the first dose in the morning, and within an hour I felt clean. Not just my lungs, which were finally clear, but my whole body. The doctor's word was energetic, and he was right. I wasn't jittery like on coffee. It was a smooth, humming power. I spent the whole day deep cleaning the house, organizing closets, paying bills. I felt sharp and capable, like my brain was working at 100% for the first time in years. This wasn't just a steroid, it was a performance-enhancing drug. I felt amazing. That night, the energy didn't stop. I went to bed exhausted, but my mind was still running a marathon. I just lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, while my wife slept beside me. I could hear every little sound in the house, the refrigerator humming, the pipes settling. My thoughts were racing, making lists, planning projects, replaying conversations from years ago. It wasn't scary, just loud. After a few hours, I gave up. I got out of bed and started cleaning the kitchen again, scrubbing the grout on the floor with a toothbrush until the sun came up. Sleep never came. By the third day, the clean energy had turned into a frantic, buzzing panic. I was standing in my spotless kitchen when I saw a single speck of dust float down and land on the countertop. It looked huge, disgusting. I felt a wave of revulsion. I scrubbed the spot with bleach until my hand was shaking. But it wasn't enough. All of a sudden, I could see them everywhere. Germs. They were coating the doorknobs, the light switches, the remote control. The air felt thick with them. My own home which I had just sterilized, suddenly felt like the most contaminated place on earth. My hands were raw from washing them, cracked and bleeding from the bleach. I started opening doors with my elbows. I refused to touch my face. My wife came home from work and tried to hug me, and I flinched away, yelling at her that she was bringing the outside world in. She just stared at me, her face a mix of confusion and fear. She couldn't see what I saw. She couldn't understand that the house was no longer safe, that we were under attack. And I was the only one who could see the enemy. I was standing in the middle of the living room, cloth in hand. I had just finished wiping down all the light switches with bleach for what felt like the 10th time. The house was as sterile as a hospital, but I still couldn't relax. I knew the enemy was invisible, just waiting for a way in. That's when our golden retriever, Gus, trotted into the room. He was a big, goofy dog, the kind of dog everyone loves. He came over and nudged my hand with his wet nose, his tail wagging, wanting to be petted. I physically recoiled, yanking my hand back like I'd been burned. I couldn't touch him. He had just been outside. He was covered in the world. He looked confused for a second, then flopped down on the rug with a soft grunt. Then he did it. He started to lick his paw. A slow, methodical, wet slurping sound that echoed in the completely silent room. My blood went cold. It wasn't a thought. It was a sudden, absolute certainty. Where had that paw been? On the grass? On the pavement where other dogs had been? Through decaying leaves and dirt and God knows what else. Now he was licking it. He was concentrating all of that microscopic filth, all of that disease, right into his mouth. He wasn't cleaning himself. He was loading up on ammunition. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. He wasn't Gus anymore. He was a vector, a walking, breathing container of pestilence that he was about to spread all over our house with every panting breath. He would lick my wife's hand. He would lick our daughter's face. He was a biological Trojan horse, invited right into our home. My wife came in from the kitchen. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost?" I couldn't even look at her. I just pointed a shaking finger at the dog. "He's filthy," I whispered. My voice was tight and shaky. "Look what he's doing. He's bringing it all inside with him." Gus stopped licking for a moment and looked up at me, his tail giving a little thump-thump on the floor. He had no idea. But I did. My shapeless, invisible terror finally had a face, and it was lying on my living room rug. "You need to get away from him," I said. My voice was low and tight. My wife looked from me to the dog and back again. Gus had stood up, his tail wagging tentatively. The sound of it thumping against a table leg was like a ticking clock. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Her voice was cautious, like she was talking to a cornered animal. "He's contaminated," I told her. I couldn't look at her. I could only look at the source of the infection. I pointed at Gus. "He's sick. He's carrying it. All of it." Without another word, I grabbed a gallon jug of bleach from the laundry room. My wife just stood there, frozen. The decontamination had to begin immediately. I started with the rug where the dog had been lying. I unscrewed the cap and just started pouring the bleach in a wide circle around the spot, then worked my way in. The chemical smell was sharp and clean. It burned my nostrils. My wife screamed my name. "What are you doing? Stop!" she yelled. But I couldn't stop. The bleach wasn't enough. The rug had to go. I started trying to drag the soaking wet rug toward the back door. It wasn't enough. The cross-contamination was everywhere. He had probably brushed against the couch. He had probably walked past the entertainment center. The particles were airborne now. I knew it. I could feel them on my skin. I went back to the couch and poured the rest of the bleach all over the cushions. The fabric fizzled. I grabbed the TV remote and dropped it into a cup, filling it with bleach. Then I looked at the TV. It was just a black mirror, reflecting the chaos of the room. I picked it up, ripped the cords out of the wall, and threw it face down on the floor. The screen shattered with a hollow boom. My wife was sobbing now, holding our 2 young kids who had run into the room. They were crying, terrified. I looked at them, and a new, horrible thought hit me. They had been in the house this whole time. They had probably petted the dog. They were exposed. "Upstairs," I said, my voice flat. "All of you, go to your bedroom, now." I herded my family up the stairs. My wife didn't argue. She just clutched the children, her eyes wide with a terror that wasn't about germs anymore. It was about me. I told them the dog was sick, that the whole house was infected, and that I had to quarantine them to keep them safe. It was the only way. I closed the bedroom door behind them, and then I pushed my daughter's heavy oak dresser in front of it. I could hear them crying on the other side of the door. It was a horrible sound. But I knew they were safe now. The infection couldn't get to them in there. Now I just had to finish sterilizing the rest of the house. They were safe. I could hear my wife trying to quiet the kids on the other side of the door. The sound was muffled. It had to be this way. I had contained the initial outbreak, but I hadn't eliminated the source. The house was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, I felt a horrible, calm clarity. It was a job I didn't want, but it was a job that had to be done. A real man protects his family, no matter what it costs. I went downstairs. The house was a wreck. The smell of bleach was so strong it made my eyes water, but it felt clean. It felt right. I walked through the ruined living room and into the kitchen. Gus was huddled under the kitchen table, whining softly. He looked up at me, his tail giving a single, hesitant thump against the floor. He knew something was wrong. I looked at him, and I didn't see our family dog. I saw a vessel of disease, a biological bomb, and my family was upstairs. "I'm sorry, Gus," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. I felt empty. I reached for his leash, hanging on a hook by the back door. The leather was familiar in my hands. I knelt down, trying to coax him out from under the table. He just flattened himself to the floor, his eyes wide. He knew. Animals know. I had to crawl under the table after him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed his collar. He yelped. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound from upstairs. Heavy wood on a wood floor. Then my wife's voice, shouting my name. I was still under the table, trying to clip the leash on, when she came flying down the stairs. She didn't even slow down. She saw what I was doing and let out a sound that wasn't a word, just a pure animal scream of terror. She launched herself at me, all nails and teeth. Her attack knocked me sideways, my head slamming against the leg of the table. She was scratching at my face, screaming, "Get away from him! Get away!" I tried to push her off, tried to explain. I have to, for us, to keep us safe. My words meant nothing. She was fighting for her life, or for his. I couldn't tell the difference. We struggled on the floor, a tangle of limbs next to the terrified, crying dog. The bleach fumes burned in my lungs. She was strong, stronger than I ever knew. She scrambled away from me, grabbing her phone from her pocket and running into the half-bathroom off the kitchen, slamming and locking the door. I got to my feet dizzy, my cheek bleeding from her nails. I was about to go to the door and tell her to stop being hysterical when I heard her voice, high and panicked. 911, please. I need help. My husband, he's having a breakdown. He's trying to kill our dog. I have my kids. We're locked in the bedroom. No, I ran downstairs. He's out here. The words hit me harder than she had. He's trying to kill our dog. Her voice, telling a stranger on the phone that she was terrified of me. I looked down at the leash, still clutched in my hand. Then I looked at Gus, who was now pressed into the farthest corner of the kitchen, shivering. And in that moment, the whole horrible delusion shattered like glass. The germs weren't real. The contamination wasn't real. There was only one monster in the house. It was me. The merger was everything. For 6 months, my life wasn't my own. It belonged to the firm, to the client, to the deal. I was a senior associate, and this was my chance to make partner. I was living on caffeine and adrenaline, working 18-hour days. My apartment was just a place to shower and change into a fresh suit. At night, I'd get home, my body buzzing with exhaustion, but my brain wouldn't shut off. Sleep just stopped happening. I'd lie in bed in the dark, my heart pounding, while my mind obsessively replayed every conversation, every email, every single clause in a 300-page contract. 2 hours of sleep turned into 1. Then 1 hour turned into just staring at the ceiling until the sun came up, feeling a cold dread creep into my bones. My performance started to slip. I was making small mistakes, stupid mistakes. And in a deal worth 9 figures, there's no such thing as a small mistake. I finally went to a doctor. A fancy one, the kind the firm kept on retainer. I told him I wasn't sleeping. I told him the pressure was immense, that I just needed something to get me through the next few weeks until the deal closed. He didn't even blink. He just nodded, like he was ordering lunch. He said, "You're burning the candle at both ends. You just need to be able to switch off." He wrote a prescription for Ambien. It was that simple. That night, I looked at the little white pill in my hand like it was a key. I remember taking it, climbing into bed, and waiting. The next thing I knew, my alarm was screaming at me. It was 6 a.m. 7 straight hours had just vanished. There were no dreams, no tossing and turning, no anxious thoughts. It was just gone. A perfect, black, empty void. I woke up feeling rested, sharp. I felt powerful again. It felt like a miracle. A magic delete button for the hours I used to spend dreading the night. I could work myself to the absolute breaking point, swallow a pill, and just erase the recovery period. I had found the perfect tool for the job. I had no idea that I wasn't just erasing the night. I was starting to erase my life. This routine went on for a few weeks. The merger was my entire world, and Ambien was the tool that let me exist in it. Then, the strange things started happening. It began subtly. I woke up one morning and walked into my kitchen, and the whole apartment smelled like roasted garlic. On the stove, in my biggest pot, was a perfectly cooked beef bolognese, like a restaurant-quality sauce, something that would take hours to make. Next to it was a half-eaten bowl. I had no memory of cooking it, not a single trace. I lived alone. I remember just staring at the pot, my brain trying to make sense of it. I figured I must have been on autopilot, a weird sleepwalking thing brought on by stress. I put the sauce in the fridge and went to work, feeling unsettled, A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was an entire roasted chicken, with potatoes and carrots sitting on a carving board on my counter. It was beautifully browned. I hadn't even bought a chicken. I checked my credit card statement on my phone. There was a charge from the grocery store down the street from the night before, timed at 11:30 p.m. I had zero memory of leaving my apartment. Then came the social media. I woke up, groggy as usual, and grabbed my phone. I had a dozen notifications from a professional networking site. Angry notifications. I opened the app, my heart starting to pound. A senior partner at the firm had posted some generic article about market trends. And under it, from my account, was a long, rambling, and incredibly aggressive comment. It accused him of being a corporate shill, of not understanding the fundamentals of the business. It was full of typos and bizarre personal insults. It was career suicide. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hit the delete button. It was gone, but the damage was done. People had seen it. I spent the next hour frantically scrolling through my other accounts, finding and deleting similar posts. Weird, angry comments left on a relative's vacation photos. A string of nonsensical replies to a news story. It was like a different person had been using my phone. A mean, drunk, and stupid person. I cleaned up the chicken, throwing most of it away. I scrubbed the pot. I tried to just forget it. I told myself it was the stress, the merger, the long hours, the exhaustion. It was all just leaking out when I was asleep. The Ambien wasn't giving me a black void of sleep anymore. It was unlocking a door for someone else to come out and live my life while I was gone. And I had no idea what he was going to do next. After the social media disaster, I told myself that was it. No more Ambien. I'd rather lie awake all night than let that other person out again. But by midnight, with my mind replaying depositions and chewing on obscure points of contract law, I caved. I just had to be sharp for the 8 a.m. call. One more night, I told myself. Just until the deal closes. I woke up suddenly in the pre-dawn dark. It wasn't a slow, groggy wake-up. It was like a switch being flipped. My eyes snapped open, and my first feeling was dread. A deep, cold, certain dread. I didn't know why. The room was silent, but something was wrong. Then I saw it. Across the room, on my desk, a faint, bluish glow. My work laptop was open. I never left my work laptop open, ever. I always shut it down and put it in its bag. It was a rule I lived by. My heart started that slow, heavy pounding it does right before something terrible happens. I got out of bed and walked over to the desk like I was approaching a bomb. My email client was open on the screen. It was showing the Sent folder. At the very top of the list was an email, sent at 2:47 a.m. My blood went cold when I saw the recipient. It was addressed to the lead counsel of the opposing firm. The subject line just said, "Strategy." My hand was shaking as I moved the cursor to click on it. The email opened. It wasn't a rambling, typo-filled rant like the social media posts. It was clean, professional, meticulously written in perfect, concise legalese. It was a bullet-point summary of our firm's entire confidential strategy for the final phase of the merger negotiations. It laid out our final offer, our absolute walk-away point, the key vulnerability we had discovered in their last filing, and the specific leverage we planned to use to force their hand. It was a complete and total betrayal. It was a roadmap to our own destruction. I just stood there, staring at the screen. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some weird sleep cooking. Someone inside my head had calmly and deliberately sat down in the middle of the night, accessed the most sensitive information I possessed, and emailed it directly to our enemy. It was the single most destructive thing I could have possibly done to my career, my firm, and my client, and I had done it in my sleep. I don't know how long I stood there, just reading the email over and over. Then my phone started ringing, vibrating on the desk next to the laptop. The sound was so loud in the silent apartment it made me jump. I looked at the screen. It was a senior partner. One of the men whose respect I had been desperate to earn for years. My hand was shaking so badly, it took me 2 tries to answer it. "Hello?" My voice was just a croak. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse. It was a cold, controlled fury. "I'm going to ask you one time, and you're going to give me a straight answer. Did you send an email to opposing counsel at 2:47 this morning?" I couldn't say anything. I just made a little sound in my throat. He didn't need me to answer. He knew. "What you've done is catastrophic," he said, his voice like ice. "Do not come into the office. Your access has been revoked. Security has your photograph. Consider your employment terminated." The line went dead. I was still holding the phone to my ear. My career, my future, everything I had sacrificed my life for over the past 6 months. It was all gone. Before I could even put the phone down, it rang again. A different partner's name on the screen. I just stared at it. It kept ringing. Then a text came through. Then another. The whole world was waking up and finding out what I had done. He had mentioned the client, the looming threat of a lawsuit, malpractice, a career-ending, life-destroying word. I looked at the ringing phone, and then back at the perfectly written email on the laptop screen. The social media posts were sloppy. The sleep cooking was bizarre. I had told myself it was just stress, a weird side effect. But this was different. This was precise. This was deliberate. This was intelligent. The thing the Ambien had let out wasn't a drunk, stumbling idiot. It was a saboteur. It used my own brain, my own vocabulary, my own knowledge of the law, and it had calmly and methodically executed my life. That was the real horror. It wasn't that I had lost control. It was that something else had taken it. I was 16 the first time I lost my mind. It was the middle of summer, and all we did was get high. We were just kids, bored, sitting in my friend's basement passing a bong around. But this one time, the weed was different. It felt different. It hit me like a train, but not in a good way. The room started to feel like it was shrinking. By the time I got home, it was full-blown. I was in my bedroom, and I was completely and utterly terrified. I could hear my parents whispering downstairs, plotting against me. I knew they were. Then I started hearing more voices, coming from outside my window, from the corners of the room. They were talking about me, saying what a failure I was, saying that everyone knew what I was thinking. My heart was a drum against my ribs. I thought I was going to die. My parents found me huddled in my closet. I don't remember much about what happened next, just snapshots. My mom's face, her eyes wide with fear. The feeling of being guided into the car. The street lights streaking by the window, each one an eye watching me. The next thing I remember clearly is the emergency room. The smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines beeping. They put me in one of those little side rooms. I couldn't stop shaking. I couldn't stop talking either. I kept trying to explain to the nurses that we were being watched, that there were microphones in the walls. They just nodded and smiled that fake, placating smile. They thought I was just some stupid kid who got too high. They weren't wrong, but this was more than that. This was real terror. A doctor finally came in. He looked tired and annoyed, like I was the last thing he wanted to deal with. My parents tried to explain what happened. He cut them off. He shined a tiny light in my eyes and then stood back, arms crossed. He sighed. "He's having a cannabis-induced psychotic episode," he said, like he was reading from a manual. "Brief, it'll pass." He scribbled on a prescription pad. "This is for Haldol," he said, handing the slip to my dad. "It's an older antipsychotic, but it works fast. It'll calm him down and help him sleep it off." Calm him down. Sleep it off. That sounded good. That sounded like a life raft. The doctor told us to go home. He didn't say anything else. No warning, no follow-up, just a prescription for a drug used to treat schizophrenia, given to a terrified teenager. We left the hospital. I thought I was getting something that would stop the noise. I had no idea I was about to find out what real silence feels like. The Haldol worked. It killed the psychosis dead. The voices went silent. The paranoia evaporated. For the first day, I just slept. A deep, dreamless, black hole kind of sleep. When I woke up, the house was just a house again. My parents were just my parents. I felt empty and exhausted, but I was sane. I thought the nightmare was over. Then, within a couple of days, the new nightmare began. It started as a little tickle deep inside my bones, a feeling of needing to stretch, but stretching didn't help. By the next day, the tickle had become an unbearable, violent hum. It was a feeling of pure, concentrated restlessness. But that word isn't strong enough. It was an agonizing, internal torture that had no source and no escape. It felt like my soul was trying to crawl out of my skin. I couldn't sit still for a second. The second I sat down, the buzzing agony would amplify until I had to jump up. I paced my bedroom in frantic circles until the carpet was worn in a track. I would stand in one place and just rock back and forth for hours. My parents tried to get me to eat at the dinner table, but I couldn't. I'd take a bite and then have to stand up and walk around the kitchen, chewing, before I could sit back down for 10 seconds. This was 1,000 times worse than the psychosis. The paranoia was terrifying, but at least the threat felt like it was coming from the outside. The voices, the plots, they were things I could hide from in a closet. This new horror was coming from inside me. There was no hiding from it. It was my own body, my own nervous system, turning against me. Sleep was impossible. How can you sleep when your own mind is screaming at you to move, move, move? I would lie in bed, my legs kicking, my entire body rigid with the effort of trying to stay still. It was an agony I can't describe. It was like being electrocuted, but slowly, from the inside out, for hours and hours and hours. There was no relief, not for a minute, and it was just getting started. It was never going to get started. It was already here. The pacing didn't stop. For a week, I existed in a state of pure, physical agony. I paced the house in a frantic loop, from my bedroom to the kitchen and back again, for hours and hours, until my feet were raw and my parents just watched me, their faces a mask of fear and confusion. I couldn't eat. How could you, when every cell in your body is screaming at you to move? I lost 15 pounds. I tried to explain the feeling. I remember telling my dad, "It's like my skeleton wants to crawl out of my skin." He didn't understand. They thought the psychosis was just changing, that I was still losing my mind. They thought this was part of the sickness. They didn't understand this was the cure. The breaking point came in the shower. I was trying to let the hot water calm me down, but it did nothing. The internal electric screaming just got louder and louder until I couldn't take it anymore. I started hitting my head against the tiled wall, hard. Anything to feel a different kind of pain, an external pain that might drown out the horror inside. My dad heard the smacking sound and forced the door open. He found me there, naked and shivering, a bruise already forming on my forehead. And he finally saw it in my eyes. It wasn't the wild-eyed look of psychosis. It was the desperate, pleading look of someone being tortured. We looked up Haldol side effects online. It took less than 5 minutes to find it. Akathisia, a movement disorder, a state of unbearable restlessness and agitation. We read the forums, post after post from people describing the exact same inner torture, the same living hell. I stopped taking the pill that day. The 2 days it took for the drug to leave my system were the worst of my entire life. But then, slowly, hour by hour, the electric hum started to fade. I remember the exact moment I was able to sit on the edge of my bed for a full minute without the urge to bolt. I just sat there and sobbed. The silence wasn't in the room. It was inside me. The lesson wasn't just to not get high. The real lesson, the one that's been burned into my nerves, is a deep and profound fear. I wasn't just some stupid kid who had a bad trip. I was a patient. I went to a professional for help, and I was given a chemical torture device, prescribed as casually as an aspirin, to sleep it off. And as you read these stories, you see it again and again. It's the unifying, terrifying thread. We all went looking for help. An art student just wants to paint again. A carpenter just wants his back to stop hurting so he can work. A father just wants to catch his breath. A lawyer just needs to get some sleep before a big meeting. We go to a doctor, a person we're taught to trust, and we tell them we're hurting. They listen, they nod, and they write on a little piece of paper. They tell us it's safe. It's non-addictive. It's a miracle. And we believe them because we're desperate. We take that little piece of paper to the pharmacy like it's a golden ticket. But it's not. It's a key. It's a key that unlocks a door in your brain you never knew existed. And out of that door walks a stranger who wears your face. A stranger who thinks he's a genius and destroys a university art studio. A stranger who barricades his own family in a bedroom to protect them from the dog they've had for 10 years. A stranger who calmly and methodically emails away your entire future in the middle of the night. We all went looking for a cure for one problem, and in return, we were handed a dozen more, each 1,000 times worse. The sickness we started with was nothing compared to the sickness we were prescribed. We just wanted to fix a small crack in our lives. Instead, we were given the tool, the permission, and the chemical instructions to burn the whole thing to the ground.